All right, so are you ready to delve into some Indian constitutional law today?
Always ready.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Um, Today's deep dive, we're going to be talking about something pretty interesting, I think at least,
Yeah.
defining the state under Article 12
Of Article 12.
of the Indian Constitution.
Yeah.
And we've got some pretty interesting law notes on Article 12. And, it gets really interesting when you start to think about who can you actually hold accountable
Mm-hmm.
for upholding fundamental rights.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to try to figure out today.
Right. And sometimes it's not always clear
Right, exactly.
who that might be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's start with the literal definition.
Okay.
Straight from Article 12, it says, the state includes the government and parliament of India,
Mm-hmm.
the government and the legislature of each of the states, and all local or other authorities within the territory of India or under the control of the government of India.
So, I mean, that seems pretty straightforward at first, but like you said, like, who are these actors? What does this really mean? And it's been debated in the courts for decades.
Yeah, it's like peeling back layers of an onion.
Yes.
Right. So, we've got the union and state governments
Mm-hmm.
and their legislatures, which kind of makes sense.
Sure.
Then we've got local authorities. I'm guessing that's your municipalities and the like.
Exactly. So, we're thinking about, your local councils, district boards, panchayats, those entities that operate at a more local level. And then, of course, the really interesting one is the other authorities.
Ooh, other authorities.
Yeah.
That sounds kind of ominous.
Well, it can be, I mean, because, of course, the Constitution's a little vague here.
Yeah.
It doesn't give us a neat list of all the things that could be. And so, it's really been up to the courts to kind of figure out, well, what fits in here? And this has caused, some pretty significant legal battles over the years.
So it's like a constitutional puzzle that the courts kind of have to solve.
Exactly. Exactly. And the solutions they've come up with have, really shaped the very fabric of Indian law.
Right.
And impacted the lives of so many people.
Okay, I'm hooked. Give us an example.
Okay, so one example that comes to mind is the Rajasthan Electricity Board case.
Yeah.
Rajasthan Electricity Board v. Mohan Lal. And this is a landmark judgment. This really kind of shook things up. And the Supreme Court basically said that other authorities includes anybody created by the Constitution or by law, even if they're engaged in what seem like commercial activities.
Hold on. So you're telling me that like a state-run electricity board, something that provides a service like a business, could be considered, the state and bound by those fundamental rights.
Exactly, exactly. It's a big deal. It means that these entities that might look and act a lot like a business can't just ignore those fundamental rights that are guaranteed. They have to respect them, just like any government department would.
That's huge. It makes you kind of look at all the organizations you deal with on a daily basis and say, wait a minute, are they bound by the Constitution too?
Exactly. And that's really, why understanding this is so crucial, It empowers you as a citizen, you know your rights, and you know who to hold accountable if those rights aren't being respected.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got this kind of broad definition of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And, we've kind of covered that. It covers a whole bunch of different entities. But the notes also mention, some key terms that need to be kind of unpacked a little bit.
Okay.
So let's start with government itself.
Okay, so government, both at the union level and at the state level.
Mm-hmm.
This really includes the executive and legislative branches.
So we're talking the executive branch, the folks who actually implement laws and policies.
Yeah.
And the legislature, the folks who are making those laws. Checks and balances, baby.
Exactly, yeah. And I think the notes give a nice, concise definition of those things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, we can't forget the parliament at the national level and the state legislatures, right? Those are the big players.
Yes.
When it comes to shaping these laws that define the relationship between the citizen and the state, right?
Absolutely. So the parliament, with the president, the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, making laws for the whole country.
Right.
And then, each state has its own legislature, of course.
Right.
And they're, crafting those laws specific to their regions.
It's like a, multi-layered cake. Each layer, building upon the other.
Yeah.
So then we've got local authorities again.
Mm-hmm.
How do they fit into all of this?
So the notes, actually, they reference Section 331 of the General Clauses Act of 1897.
Ah, the good old legal jargon. Love that.
You gotta love it.
So what does that tell us?
Well, so it defines local authority as those entities that we talked about earlier. So, municipal committees, district boards, and anybody that's, legally allowed to kind of handle those, municipal or local funds.
Right.
And then, of course, village panchayats.
Okay.
And we know that because of the Ajit Singh case.
Yep.
Ajit Singh via state of Punjab.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's basically just kind of like a confirmation that even those, hyper-local
Right.
governing bodies, they fall under the umbrella of the state.
Yeah. Okay. So to make things even clearer,
Mm-hmm.
the notes say there's a 7-point test
Yes.
established in the Mohammed Yassin case.
Mohammed Yassin v. Town Area Committee.
Yes. To help determine if an entity actually qualifies as a local authority. Hit me with the highlights here. What are the key things that make a local authority a part of the state?
Okay, so, first off, it's got to be a separate legal entity. Kind of like a corporation. It can't just be a branch of the government. It needs its own legal standing.
Okay.
It also has to function within a specific geographical area.
Makes sense.
So think your town or village or,
Right.
whatever.
What else?
And importantly, at least some portion of it needs to be elected by the people who live there.
So it's about having a direct connection
Right.
to the people it governs.
To the people it governs.
Okay, that makes sense. What about its powers?
Okay, so it needs some degree of autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's not completely independent, it also has to be officially given governmental duties
Okay.
by law.
So it's not just about having a geographical area.
Right.
It's about governing that area.
It's about governing it.
Right.
Yeah. So think, healthcare, education, water supply, town planning, that sort of thing.
Right. What's the last point?
Okay, so, and then lastly, it needs the power to actually raise its own funds.
Right.
So whether it's through, taxes or fees or, whatever, it can't be completely reliant on the central or state government for all of its money.
Right. So it means they have a certain level of financial independence.
Exactly. And, I think that's really why this 7-point test is so important.
Yeah.
Because it's really ensuring that, whatever's labeled as a local authority is actually, operating like a governing body.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got the government, the parliament,
Mm-hmm.
state legislatures, and the local authorities,
Mm-hmm.
all pretty well defined.
Yeah.
What about that mysterious other authorities category? It feels like a bit of a wild card.
It's a big one. This has been the subject of, like I said, some of the most fascinating legal wrangling. The Constitution doesn't define it, so it's really up to the courts to figure out where the lines are.
It's a legal gray area.
It is. It's constantly being explored, redefined through court judgments. That's where we're going to head next time.
Ooh. Okay, get ready for some landmark cases, shifting interpretations,
Yeah,
and a whole lot of legal intrigue.
a lot of intrigue.
All right, so see you next time.
See you next time. So let's unpack this other authorities a little bit further. It's really about understanding that, government functions, they can be performed not just by, traditional government departments, but also by, these kind of autonomous bodies,
Right.
like companies or corporations or, societies that, might seem private on the surface.
So these entities that are kind of blurring the lines between, public and private.
Yeah. Exactly. And the courts have really had to kind of grapple with this question, Even if an organization is, engaging in, what seems like a commercial activity, could they still be considered a part of the state?
So it's not really about what they do, but where their power comes from.
Exactly, yeah. Initially, there was this tendency to use what's called the adjustum generis principle,
Oh, yeah.
which means of the same kind. And we saw this in the University of Madras case.
Okay.
University of Madras v. Shantabai.
Yeah.
So back then, other authorities was limited to those who were, performing tasks similar to the government, collecting taxes or, maintaining law and order.
Right.
But then the Ujjambabai case, Ujjambabai v. State of UP, this case kind of challenged that narrow view. And the Supreme Court was like, hold on, the entities listed in Article 12 are way too diverse to just, lump them together based on their functions.
So the focus shifted from like what they do to why they have the power to do it.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And this shift, this was a big deal because it led to that landmark judgment in Rajasthan Electricity Board.
Oh, yeah?
Rajasthan Electricity Board v. Mohan Lal, remember?
Yeah.
The court basically said, hey, if you're created by the Constitution or by law,
Right.
and you're given powers by that law, then guess what? You're a part of the state, even if you're selling electricity.
Even if you're running around.
Yeah.
Like a business.
Right.
Exactly. And so this case, I mean, it really significantly expanded the scope of other authorities. And it really brought, a lot of organizations under the umbrella of, the state and under the obligation to uphold fundamental rights.
It's like a bunch of organizations got a constitutional wake-up call.
Right.
So what are some real world examples of how this plays out?
Okay, so one example that comes to mind is the Som Prakash Rekhi case.
Okay.
So Prakash Rekhi v. Union of India.
Yeah.
So this case, the question was whether the Burma Shell Oil Storage and Distributing Company could be considered the state.
Oil companies, big players.
Big players, right.
Yeah.
But in this case, the court said, nope.
Really?
Yeah, even though, the government held a majority of shares and could appoint directors, the court was like, well, their control is limited. It's limited to policy matters, not day-to-day operations.
It's not enough.
So even with some government involvement, it's about the degree of control, not just the fact that it exists.
It's about the degree, yeah. And then you can contrast this with the Sukhdev Singh case.
Okay.
Sukhdev Singh v. Bhagatram Sardar Singh Raghuvanshi. A mouthful. But in this case, a society that was running a college that was registered under the Societies Registration Act.
Okay.
This was deemed a part of the state.
Wait, hold on. A society running a college, that doesn't sound very state-like.
No. But, they were almost completely reliant on government grants for their funding. And the government had significant control over, their management. Appointing, removing committee members. So despite their, seemingly kind of private nature, they were effectively just like an instrument of the state.
So the financial dependence and the control over management.
Yeah, that tipped the scales in that case. And so these cases kind of show, that there's no magic formula here, you know. The courts really have to look at the specific facts of each case to determine if an entity really falls under that definition.
Okay, so let's move on to a case that deals with a different aspect of this.
All right.
The R.D. Shetty case.
Okay.
R.D. Shetty International Airport Authority. This one involved the International Airport Authority of India.
Yes, the IAAI.
Right.
And so in this case, the question was, hey, is this a statutory corporation created by Parliament?
Right.
Can we consider it an other authority under Article 12, even though they're engaged in, running an airport, which seems commercial?
So we're moving away from control and kind of focusing more on how the entity was created.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And what the court said was, yes, the IAII is an other authority, and they're bound by fundamental rights.
Okay.
They said, look, it's created by law.
Right.
It's got legal powers, and the things it does, managing this airport, impacts the public, So
even though running an airport seems like a business, the fact that it was created by law and impacts everybody makes it part of the state in the eyes of the court.
Exactly. And this was, this was a big deal because this really kind of broadened the understanding of other authority, to encompass this wider range of entities. And it kind of reinforces the idea that protecting fundamental rights sometimes requires a pretty broad understanding of the state.
It's like the court is saying, we're not going to get hung up on labels here.
Right.
If you've got power and you're impacting people's lives, you need to be held accountable to the Constitution.
Exactly. Which brings us to another interesting case, the Pradeep Kumar Biswas case.
Okay.
Pradeep Kumar Biswas v. Indian Institute of Chemical Biology. This one really gets into, what's a governmental function.
Okay. Research doesn't immediately, scream government to me.
Right, exactly. So the Indian Institute of Chemical Biology was a research institute. It was registered as a society. And the petitioner in this case was basically arguing that, hey, because they receive government funding and they do research that's, for the government, their functions are basically governmental.
So once again, it's that close relationship with the government kind of being scrutinized.
Exactly. And the court, they kind of looked closely at what the Institute actually did.
Okay.
And they said, look, yeah, they get government funding, but they've got a lot of autonomy. They choose their own research topics. So, just doing research that maybe aligns with, some of the government's interests doesn't automatically make you a state actor.
Interesting. So it's like a line between being influenced by the government and being controlled by the government when it comes to defining governmental functions.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And, I think the court was really careful not to, broaden the definition of, governmental function too much. They were really looking for that direct connection to, the core functions of the state.
It's like they were saying, we're not going to just, turn every organization that gets a government grant
right.
into part of the state. There needs to be something more there.
Yeah, exactly. And so, these cases really show how, the courts are constantly kind of, analyzing and refining this definition of the state as new situations arise.
It's like a legal dance.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out, where the boundaries are.
Exactly. But, what about those times when the lines get even blurrier, with multinational corporations that are operating across borders? Does Article 12, does it apply there,
Right.
And the notes mention the Union Carbide case, which, while it didn't directly address whether a multinational corporation could be the state, it did spark a lot of debate.
Right.
Right. About, how far Indian law can reach.
Right, the Bhopal gas tragedy.
Exactly.
Yeah. Even though, there wasn't a definitive ruling on whether or not, Union Carbide could be considered the state, it brought up some big questions.
It did. It really got people thinking about, can foreign companies that are operating in India be held accountable, for human rights violations under Indian law? It really kind of highlighted the complexity of applying Article 12 in this kind of globalized world that we live in.
Yeah. So it's like Article 12 is being challenged to adapt to this world where power isn't always just within, national borders.
Yeah, exactly. It's a reminder that legal principles sometimes need to be flexible to address these changing power dynamics.
Right.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Government control, statutory creation, governmental functions, even the reach of Article 12 in a globalized world. But there's one big question that we haven't tackled.
Oh, I think I know what you're going to say. What about the judiciary itself?
Yeah. Can the branch of government that is responsible for interpreting the Constitution be considered the state under the very definition it's supposed to be interpreting?
It's mind-boggling.
It's a head-scratcher. Where do we even begin with that one? Well, the notes point to this crucial distinction, right? Between the judiciary's judicial functions and their non-judicial functions.
That's it. That's the key.
Right.
It's all about what hat are they wearing at any given time, So when they're making judgments in court cases, they're not considered the state.
So if a court decision impacts my rights, I can't really argue that the court itself violated my rights.
Generally not.
Yeah.
And the Rupa Ashokara case, Rupa Ashokaravi Ashokara,
really kind of highlights this. Judges are basically, they're interpreting and applying the laws that exist. They're not creating new laws. They're acting as referees in those situations, not rule makers.
Okay, that makes sense. But, the notes also say that when the judiciary steps outside of that purely judicial role, maybe setting administrative rules or managing its own affairs, then they might be considered the state.
Yeah. Think of it this way. If the judiciary is doing something that impacts people's rights, but it's not directly related to deciding a specific case in front of them, that's when they might be treated as the state under Article 12.
Can you give me an example of when that might actually happen?
Yeah, sure. So the Vineet Narain case,
Okay.
Vineet Narain v. Union of India.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, the Supreme Court actually issued some guidelines to prevent sexual harassment at workplaces. So they weren't deciding a specific case here, but they were setting rules that would have this broad impact.
So that's kind of like a non-judicial function because they're trying to shape how organizations behave, not just settle a dispute between two parties.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, because it was a non-judicial function, those guidelines could theoretically be challenged, right? If someone felt like their fundamental rights were being violated.
Interesting. So it's even though the court was trying to do something good, they still have to operate within the limits of the Constitution, right?
Exactly, yeah. And that's, that's kind of the beauty of this whole system of checks and balances.
Right. Now, the notes also mentioned the state of Rajasthan case.
Okay.
State of Rajasthan v. Union of India. What happened there?
So in this case, the Supreme Court was actually kind of looking at whether the High Court had overstepped its boundaries by giving some directions to the state government about, how to appoint lawyers.
Right.
So they were basically asking, is the High Court acting more like the executive branch, making decisions instead of just interpreting the law?
So it's all about making sure each branch of government stays in its lane.
Exactly. And, the Supreme Court found that, while the High Court's actions in this case, they were administrative, they were still subject to review, to make sure that nobody's rights were being violated.
So even when the judiciary is acting in this non-judicial capacity, it's still not above the law.
No, not at all. I mean, that's a really important point,
So-
The Constitution provides those safeguards against anyone using power arbitrarily, no matter who it is.
Wow. So we covered so much ground today, from the literal definition of the state all the way to these really nuanced questions about, judicial accountability. It's amazing how much depth there is to this seemingly, simple concept.
It is, It's amazing to me how the definition of the state has evolved to encompass this, really wide range of entities. We're talking companies, societies, potentially even those operating across international borders.
It's exciting and a little bit daunting, right?
It is, because it feels like we're, kind of at the edge of this whole new era of, legal interpretation.
Right, exactly. Well, this deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding of what it means to define the state and, how that impacts all of our rights.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah.
I hope our listeners out there, they feel empowered to think about these issues, to engage with them, to really think critically about the role of the state in their lives and to advocate for themselves.
Absolutely. If there's one takeaway from today, it's that the definition of the state is not set in stone. It's a living concept. And it's our responsibility to make sure that this definition continues to evolve in a way that, protects our freedoms and upholds those principles of justice and fairness.
Absolutely. Well said. Well, until next time, stay curious and keep those legal minds engaged, because the pursuit of knowledge is a journey that never ends.
And as we continue on that journey, let's work together to create a world where power is exercised responsibly, ethically, and always in service of the common good.